Did you know there are over 300,000 different kinds of fruits? Some are small like blueberries, while others can grow to be massive like the giant pumpkin that weighs more than 270 kilograms. But have you ever wondered how flowers turn into fruit? When you look at a flower, you may notice parts like the petals, the sepals, and the stigma. You might also notice a central part called the pistil, which looks a lot like a vase. In fact, that's exactly what the scientists who study plants call it, the plant vase. Well, technically, its formal name is Genesium, but we're going to stick to plant vase. It turns out that the plant vase is actually made up of 3 parts. The top part is called the stigma, which is a sticky situation. The middle section is the style, which is like a pole connecting the top and bottom parts. And finally, at the bottom, there's the ovary. Inside this structure lies an even smaller structure called the ovule. Now there's another important structure inside the flower called the androecium. We usually refer to these structures as the flower's male part. It produces pollen, which has all the genetic information needed to make babies. So if the flower's female parts are trapped inside the plant vase and the pollen is produced outside in the androecium, how do they get together? Well, it turns out that plants have evolved some pretty creative ways of getting the pollen grains from the male part to the sticky stigmas at the top of the plant vase. Some rely on wind or water to transport the pollen. However, many of them depend on pollinators like bees or butterflies. When insects fly from flower to flower looking for food, they pick up pollen on their legs and bodies. As they visit the next flower, some of that pollen falls off and lands on the stigma. If the pollen is compatible with the flower it landed on, it begins to grow. A tube grows down through the style and into the ovary where the ovules are held. Once the pollen reaches the ovule, fertilization occurs. But hold on, rewind the tape a little bit. What is the process that turns a fertilized ovule into a fruit? Well, to answer that question, we need to understand what happens after the pollen grain reaches the stigma. As mentioned earlier, once the pollen grain lands on a compatible stigma, it begins to grow. To be clear, we're talking about the pollen grain's generative cell, which contains all the genetic material. This cell divides into 2 sperm cells, each containing half the genetic material of the pollen parent. At the same time, the ovule contains an egg cell that has half the genetic material of the flower parent. When the sperm cell reaches the ovule, one lucky sperm cell fertilizes the egg cell. They combine their genetic material, and congratulations, you've got yourself a zygote. Okay, maybe skip the confetti for now. That's only the beginning. After fertilization, the zygote begins dividing. It goes from a single cell to 2 cells, then 4 cells, then 8 cells, and so on. Within the ovule, other interesting things are happening. There's a part of the flower called the integuments. These are the layers that surround the ovule, and they start to develop into a protective structure around the embryo called the seed coat. Meanwhile, the ovary wall develops into a fruit. All right, let's take a step back and digest that information. First, the pollen grain lands on the stigma. Then a pollen tube grows down the style into the ovary. Next, a sperm cell fertilizes the egg cell within the ovule. After fertilization, the zygote divides and grows into an embryo. Finally, the ovary becomes a fruit while the ovule's walls become the seed coat and the embryo is nurtured inside. Okay, now that we've figured out how flowers turn into fruits, I have some exciting news to share with you. Wait until you see what happens next. It's truly amazing. But before we continue, let me ask you a question. Have you ever noticed how the shape of a fruit often matches the shape of the ovary it came from? For example, look at this tomato. Now take a closer look at the ovary of a tomato flower. Do you see the resemblance? It turns out that this is a general trend among plants. This intriguing observation led researchers to wonder if the fruit's shape could provide clues about the flower's shape. To find answers, scientists conducted an experiment with 3 types of plants: tomatoes, peppers, and eggplants. They wanted to see how the shapes of the ovary and the fruit compared. Here's what they discovered. The shape of the ovary was a great predictor of the fruit shape. Interestingly, this relationship wasn't limited to the plants used in the experiment. Scientists looked at 56 different plant species and found that the shape of the unripe ovary predicted the shape of the ripe fruit across the board. But hold on a second. There's another twist in this story. Turns out that the shape of the fruit isn't always determined solely by the ovary. Other factors can also play a role, especially in plants that produce fleshy fruits like tomatoes and peppers. These plants rely on animals to eat their fruit and spread their seeds. But why is this important? Well, because the animals that eat these fruits have preferences for certain shapes. For example, birds prefer spherical fruits because they can easily be grabbed with their beaks and don't roll off branches. This preference has led to an interesting evolutionary development. Over time, the ovary shape has started to shift in response to the preferences of these animal seed dispersers. Here's an example. In a study published in the journal Evolution, researchers examined the fruits of two groups of plants, those that relied on birds for dispersal and those that didn't. The fruits in the bird dispersal group were generally rounder than those that didn't rely on birds. Another study published in the journal PNAS found that fruits with a specific shape called oblate spheroid, basically squished spheres, were more likely to be dispersed by ants. But wait, there's more. Sometimes the fruit shape doesn't match the ovary shape because of how the fruit grows after it splits open. For instance, in eggplants, the ovary splits along 2 sides, while in tomatoes, it splits along 5 sides. The number of splits affects the final shape of the fruit. Eggplants end up with 4 sections, while tomatoes end up with 5, even though their ovaries originally had 5 and 4 sections respectively. So remember that juicy red sphere you thought was a tomato? Well, it turns out that the shape of a fruit can tell us a lot about its evolutionary journey, including how it's dispersed, the animals that eat it, and even how its ovaries split open. Alright, we've come to the final moment of our exploration into how flowers turn into fruit. If you've been holding on to your seat, I'm about to blow your mind. Are you ready? Here it comes. But first, I have a question for you. Since we talked about how the ovary becomes a fruit, have you ever wondered what happens to the rest of the flower after fertilization? Well, it turns out that the fate of the flower depends on the type of plant. In some cases, the entire flower withers away after fertilization. In others, the flower remains attached to the developing fruit. Interestingly, recent research suggests that there might be a connection between the flower's survival and the presence of certain proteins. According to a study published in the journal Science Advances, the level of these proteins increases after fertilization. Moreover, the proteins seem to be more abundant in flowers that remain attached to the developing fruit. While more research is needed to fully understand the significance of these proteins, it's possible that they play a role in maintaining the flower and ensuring its longevity. In contrast, other studies have suggested that the flower's fate might be influenced by environmental factors such as light availability. For instance, in a study published in the journal Plant, Cell and Environment, researchers found that flowers that received more sunlight were more likely to wither away after fertilization compared to those in shaded areas. Additionally, the timing of flower death might be related to the plant's reproductive strategy. Some plants may benefit from investing their resources into producing more flowers rather than maintaining the flower that has already produced fruit. By shedding the old flower, the plant can redirect its energy towards new growth and maximize its reproductive output. Overall, the lifespan of a flower after fertilization appears to be a complex interplay of factors, including internal hormonal changes, the presence of specific proteins, and external environmental conditions. Further research is necessary to fully unravel the intricacies of these processes and gain a deeper understanding of how flowers transition from flowering to fruiting. That's it for today. But before you go, I have one more fascinating question for you. What do you think? Let us know in the comments below. And hey, if you want to see more amazing discoveries, don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for joining me on this incredible journey of discovery. Until next time, stay curious and keep asking questions.